This program correlates with the Small Gas Engine Training Materials by Alfred C. Roth and published by the Goodhart-Wilcox Company. Small Gas Engine Reassembly. This video will summarize the steps for proper reassembly of typical small gas engines. It will demonstrate how to assemble both 2- and 4-stroke cycle engines by showing you how to install the valve train, reciprocating assembly including the crankshaft, piston rings, as well as the external parts during a complete rebuild. To prepare for reassembly, make sure you have cleaned, inspected, and measured all parts to see if they are within factory specifications. Also, order any new parts, gaskets, and seals you will need but didn't previously order. To install new crankshaft seals, double-check that they are the right size. If the seal has a metal body, coat the outside of the seal with sealer to help prevent oil leakage. Place the crankcase on wooden blocks to protect it from damage when driving in the new seals, and make sure you're wearing eye protection. Select the correct diameter driver. It should be slightly smaller in diameter than the outside of the seal. Carefully drive the seal in until it's seated lightly. Do not let the seal rock sideways. If the seal has a rubber outside skin, like this one, you do not need to use sealer. A light coating of oil can be applied to help the seal slide into place in its bore. Next, install the governor flyweight mechanism and other parts that mount on the crankcase. The flyweights must swing out freely when spun by hand. If an oil pump mounts in the cover, it should be installed now. You should have already measured the rotor and pump bore to make sure they are not worn beyond specifications. After oiling the pump parts, fit them into place. If needed, use snap ring pliers to fit the snap ring into its shaft groove. Pushing down with your thumb or fingernail will help it snap into place. Now measure rotor side clearance. Bolt the pump cover in place over a strip of plastic gauge, then remove the cover. The paper scale will show clearance in thousandths of an inch. Fit a new seal or gasket onto the pump cover and install them. Hand start the bolts or screws to prevent cross-threading. Then use a 3/8 inch drive torque wrench to tighten the pump cover screws to specifications. Taking the time to torque fasteners to factory specifications will prevent leakage and strip fasteners. Make sure the oil pump turns freely. If used, lubricate and install the oil pressure relief valve. Make sure it is facing in the correct direction to accept its spring. Then slide in the spring and tighten down the cover nut properly. With valve and block engines, begin valve train assembly by checking valve clearance. Turn the crankshaft until one of the valve tappets is all the way up and the other is fully down. Then you can check clearance on the fully closed valve. Slide the correct size flat feeler gauge between the tappet and valve stem. If there is not enough clearance, you will have to grind off material from the valve stem tip using V-blocks and a grinder. The feeler gauge must fit perfectly between each of the tappets and valves. Next, install the valve springs. Make sure the intake and exhaust springs are interchangeable. Sometimes the exhaust valve spring will be longer than the intake valve spring, so make sure you always install the springs correctly. Refer to the service manual if in doubt. With a valve and block engine, a special spring compressor should be used to install the springs over the valve stems. Fit the spring retainer and spring into the jaws of the compressor. Many technicians like to position the retainer opening in alignment with the end of the compressor jaws to simplify fitting the retainer into the groove in the valve stem. Tighten the tool handle to compress the spring coils. Make sure you're wearing eye protection. It is possible for the compressed coil spring to fly out of the tool with considerable force. Slide the valve up, then fit the spring, retainer, and tool over the end of the valve stem. While pushing in on the tool to hold the retainer centered on the valve, unscrew the tool to release the spring. Carefully pull outward to remove the tool. Double check that the small hole in the center of the retainer or keeper is fully engaged in the valve stem. When installing the breather cover, make sure the oil drain holes face down. Fit the gasket in place so that the notches in it align with these holes. When tightening the breather screws, be careful not to over-tighten them and strip the small threads in the aluminum case. To install overhead valves, you must use slightly different procedures. Oil the valve stems and slide them into their valve guides. Fit the new valve stem seals over the stems and onto the head. If you use a positive locking type seal, they must snap down over the upper end of the guide before valve installation. Position the valve spring and retainer over the valve stem. Then you can use a C-clamp type valve spring compressor to squeeze the spring coil together to gain clearance for inserting the small keepers into the valve stem groove. To keep the spring from flying out, hold the compressor securely and keep it square on the spring. Lay one of the keepers on top of the valve stem, then use your finger to hold the other keeper in place as you release the spring compressor. Repeat this on the other valve spring assembly. To install the crankshaft, coat all journal surfaces with heavy motor oil to protect them during initial startup. Fit the crankshaft into the main bore in the crankcase while being careful not to hit or cut the new seal. To reassemble a piston and rod, check for alignment markings on the piston like this notch. It must align with rod markings like these tabs. Begin fitting the piston onto the rod. Using soft jaw covers on the vise, lightly clamp the rod to hold it during piston and pin installation. Install one of the snap rings into the piston. Oil the pin and then slide it through the piston and the rod's small end. Double check to be certain the piston is facing correctly on the rod. Refer to your manual if needed. Now, install the other snap ring. Make sure both snap rings are pushed fully into the groove in the piston. Severe engine damage will result if either clip is not fully seated. To install the piston rings, place the rod in the vise so the piston rests on the jaw covers, so it will not move. Read the directions that come with the rings. They will show you how to orient the rings in their grooves. Quite often, the compression rings will have a top and a bottom. Chamfers or steps are formed on them to aid ring sealing. It is important that you install each correctly. Oil control rings can also vary. If a visible difference in ring shape is not evident, look for a dot or mark on the side of the compression rings. It will indicate the top. Begin installation by using your ring expander to install the oil ring. Only expand the ring enough to fit it over the piston. Overexpansion can break or snap the brittle ring. Then install the compression rings. Make sure you have the top of the ring oriented up and only expand the ring enough for it to slide down over the piston. You may have to wiggle and push down so that you do not overextend and damage the ring. Repeat this on the top compression ring. Lubricate the piston rings and piston skirt. A coating of heavy oil is needed to prevent cylinder ring and piston scoring upon initial engine startup. Next, space the ring gaps away from each other. Generally, rotate each ring gap to the opposite side of the piston, just to one side of the piston pinhole. This will produce the longest distance between each ring gap to minimize ring leakage for maximum engine power and efficiency. Now you are ready to install the rod and piston assembly on the cylinder block. Use a ring compressor to squeeze the rings into their grooves so that the piston will slide down into the cylinder. Install the compressor with its arrow facing down. The bottom of the tool is dimpled so that it will not wedge down into the cylinder. Clamp the tool around the piston to compress the rings. Make sure the tool is square on the piston. Then, with a soft hammer or mallet handle, push the piston down into the cylinder while carefully guiding the connecting rod over the crankshaft journal. You do not want the rod to jam into the journal and nick or damage it. Oil the rod cap and fit it into place. Make sure the tabs or alignment marks on the rod and cap align. If you install the cap backwards, engine damage will result and the engine will probably lock up. With an oil slinger and locking plate in position, torque the connecting rod bolts to specifications. Tighten each bolt a couple of times to ensure proper torquing. These bolts must withstand more stress than any other bolts in the engine. They must be torqued properly to ensure normal engine life. After torquing, bend the locking tabs to secure the rod bolts. To install the lifters or tappets, coat them with heavy grease. Then fit each lifter into its lifter bore in the block. The thick grease will hold the lifters in place and keep them from falling during camshaft installation. Also, wipe grease on the camshaft lobes to protect them at startup. Turn the crankshaft until its timing mark points at the camshaft bearing bore. Then fit the camshaft into place so that its timing mark aligns with the timing mark on the crankshaft. Make sure that the marks align perfectly. Fit the new crankcase gasket over its dowels. If dowel pins are not provided, you may want to apply a light coating of adhesive to hold the gasket. While guiding the seals over their shafts, lower the crankcase cover onto the cylinder block until it is in full contact with the gasket. Use a torque wrench and a crisscross pattern to tighten the cover bolts to specifications. The assembly of the bottom end of many two-stroke cycle engines is quite different than just described. For example, you may have to clean the mating surfaces on the crankcase with an approved solvent. The crankcase halves often do not use a gasket. Never scrape on the flange because leakage can result from the slightest nick. If the two-stroke rod uses needle bearings, refer to your service manual procedures to ensure you have the correct size bearings. Wrap the needle bearings around the crankshaft rod journal. If you are reusing the needle bearings, apply heavy grease to hold them on the crank journal. Watch for any rod offset so that the connecting rod is installed in the right direction. Slowly work the rod big end bore over the crankshaft and the needle bearings, being careful not to dislodge and drop any of the small needle bearings. Double check that they are all in place after fitting the rod. Replace any anti-friction main bearings not in perfect condition. If they are rough or binding, replace them. If used, install any governor balls into the crankshaft counterweight using heavy grease to hold them in place. Then slide the governor collar, main bearings, washers, and seals onto the crankshaft in the right sequence and facing in the right direction. They should slide easily into place if you have the crankshaft cleaned properly. Oil the inside of the seal before sliding it onto the crankshaft. Make sure the seal is facing with its lip inward. Coat the piston and rings with heavy motor oil. Then fit the assembly down into the crankcase. Wiggle the piston so that the chamfer on the lower end of the cylinder pushes inward on the rings, allowing the crankshaft to slide into place. The crankshaft should turn freely, and the ring should not be catching on the transfer ports. Run a continuous bead of approved sealant around the crankcase flange. Carefully circle all bolt holes. Try to run a continuous bead without breaking the bead. Allow the sealant to cure as recommended by the manufacturer for a few minutes. Then, carefully lower the crankcase cover onto the cylinder block without smearing the sealant. Install and torque the crankcase bolts to specifications using a torque wrench and a crisscross tightening pattern. Proper torquing will help ensure that the two-stroke crankcase does not leak. After torquing the bolts, again check that the crankshaft turns freely. To install a cylinder head for a valve-in-block engine, place the new head gasket on top of the block with the holes in alignment. Then fit the clean head and any shroud into place. Lubricate the bolt threads to aid torquing. Then hand start all the bolts, making sure you have any longer bolts in their right locations. This engine uses 3 longer bolts around the exhaust port. Use a torque wrench to tighten all the head bolts in a crisscross pattern. Your service manual will give a detailed explanation of the proper torque value and sequence for the head bolts. Since the head gasket must seal combustion pressure, it is very important that you tighten these bolts correctly. If the engine is an overhead valve design, use a similar procedure. Fit the head gasket and cylinder head in place. Do not use sealer. Some head bolts use special metal washers with rubber seals on them. The seals prevent oil from seeping down around the head bolt threads. New washers are normally recommended on the bolts located under the valve cover. When installing the push rods, check whether one of the rods is hollow. If one is hollow, it must be installed in the correct lifter to carry oil up to the rocker arms. If you install it wrong, the valve train will starve for oil and wear quickly. Fit any stem caps over the valve stems. Then install the rocker arms onto their studs. Lubricate these parts generously to prevent wear during startup. If the rocker arm adjustment nut has a set screw, loosen it before installation. Spin the adjustment nuts down and then adjust valve clearance. With a valve fully open or down, fit the specified size feeler gauge between the rocker arm and valve. Turn the nut until there is a slight drag when pulling on the feeler gauge. To lock your adjustment, tighten the set or lock screw, then double check your clearance. Repeat this on the other valve. A few engines use an adjustable lifter. Valve clearance is set in the same manner as just described. After installing the valve train, align the new valve cover gasket on the head. Then install the valve cover by torquing its bolts to specifications in a crisscross pattern. Install external parts like the magneto coil in a logical sequence. If you are reassembling an older engine, install the points, condenser, and their cover. Fit the flywheel over the crankshaft, making sure the key is fully down in its keyway. Note that this flywheel washer is cupped. Install it with a raised part of the washer outward. Install the flywheel nut or one-way clutch. Use a flywheel holding tool and spanner wrench to tighten the one-way clutch properly. A flywheel holding tool will grasp the flywheel fins without damaging them. A spanner wrench will grasp the tangs on the outside of the one-way clutch so that you can tighten them with a ratchet, then a torque wrench. To install the flywheel screen, find the 2 openings formed in the screen. Fit them over the threaded holes on the flywheel and then carefully tighten the 2 small screws. Next, you might install the governor arm onto its shaft. Then, assemble all governor linkage rods and springs. Make sure you install all linkage rods in their recommended holes in the linkage arms. You will have to modify your procedures for the exact make and model engine being serviced. It's often necessary to install choke and governor linkages before bolting the carburetor onto the engine. With the bolts in the carburetor flange, fit the new carburetor base plate gasket into position. Then, while holding the bolts with your fingers, fit the carburetor onto the cylinder head and hand start the bolts to prevent cross-threading. Use a wrench or screwdriver to tighten the carburetor mounting bolts securely. Install the fuel line before checking for linkage problems. Move all linkages to make sure none of the rods are binding. Typically, move the throttle to the wide open position so you can adjust the governor. Check that the carburetor throttle lever stays fully open. Loosen the lock nut on the governor lever and turn the shaft fully clockwise. Then, lock down your adjustment by tightening the nut. Next, install the breather tube and the breather cover onto the carburetor fitting. If the carburetor does not mount on the fuel tank, make sure you connect its fuel line securely, installing a new fuel filter and rubber hose if needed. Remember that a fuel leak could cause a fire. With two-stroke cycle engines, it is best to always install a new reed valve during a major rebuild. Fit the new O-ring seal around the valve, coat it with grease, and then place it into its proper position on the side of the crankcase. To install the muffler, you must normally use a special heat-resistant gasket. The shiny side usually faces the head. Fit the gasket into position, align the holes, install the muffler bolts, and then torque them to specifications. If the old muffler bolt heads were badly rusted, replace them. Using slip joint pliers, bend any locking washers to keep the muffler bolts from loosening. Install any other shrouds around the cylinder. Then you can bolt on the flywheel shroud. Make sure the shroud is aligned properly before tightening any of its bolts. Install any remaining parts like these pulleys. You may have to wait to tighten their set screws until after mounting the engine on the implement so that the pulleys can be properly aligned. Finally, fill the engine with a factory-recommended viscosity motor oil. Check the engine's oil capacity so that you do not overfill it. Snug down the oil fill plug and start the engine. During engine break-in, fast idle the engine until warm. Avoid prolonged high RPM operation, and most important, do not let the engine overheat or you could score its cylinder. As the engine runs, watch for oil leaks and check the oil often until the rings seat properly.